This should have never happened. I'm very upset about it. This could have been my granddaughter, my daughter. This is somebody's child. I'm very pissed off about it.
On the morning of January 26, 2017, 14-year-old Alianna DeFreeze left her home in Cleveland, Ohio, expecting to do something completely ordinary: go to school. She followed the same kind of routine she had followed many times before. She left home, boarded a Greater Cleveland Regional Transit Authority bus, and began the trip toward E-Prep and Village Prep Woodland Hills, where she was a 7th grade student. But Alianna never entered her classroom. By the time her family realized she had not arrived at school, several hours had already passed. What started as a missing child investigation quickly became a race against time. Detectives began retracing her final known movements, reviewing surveillance footage, speaking with witnesses, and searching every possible location connected to her route. The investigation soon uncovered a disturbing timeline. A surveillance camera captured Alianna during the final confirmed moments of her journey. A man appeared nearby shortly after she exited the bus. Investigators would later identify that man as Christopher Whitaker, a convicted felon with a violent criminal history. But solving the case would require more than identifying a suspect. Detectives had to piece together a chain of evidence that included witness accounts, forensic testing, surveillance footage, and a careful reconstruction of what happened after Alianna disappeared. The case would eventually lead to a courtroom battle where prosecutors sought the death penalty, a conviction that brought legal accountability, and a family determined to make sure Alianna's name represented more than the tragedy that took her life. Her disappearance also exposed serious concerns about how quickly parents are notified when a child fails to arrive at school. Those concerns led to changes in Ohio law designed to prevent other families from experiencing the same uncertainty. But before Alianna DeFreeze became the subject of headlines, court proceedings, and legislation, she was a 14-year-old girl with a family who loved her, a school she attended, and a future she should have had the chance to experience. This documentary follows the complete timeline of Alianna's story, from her life before January 26, 2017, to the investigation that uncovered the truth, the trial of Christopher Whitaker, and the lasting impact her family created in her memory. Every detail presented is based on documented evidence, court records, and verified reporting. If you appreciate carefully researched true crime documentaries that focus on facts, investigations, and the people behind the headlines, consider subscribing. Your support allows us to continue creating in-depth stories that remember victims with accuracy and respect. Now, let's begin with the person at the center of this case. Before she became known across Cleveland as the victim of a heartbreaking crime, Alianna DeFreeze was simply a daughter, a student, and a young girl whose life was far bigger than the tragedy that followed. This is her story. Before investigators, courtrooms, and headlines focused on the circumstances surrounding her disappearance, Alianna DeFreeze was known by the people closest to her as a young girl with her own personality, interests, and daily life. Alianna was 14 years old and lived in Cleveland, Ohio, with her family. She was raised by her mother, Alianna DeFreeze, who played an important role in maintaining the structure and stability in her daughter's life. Her father, Damon DeFreeze, was also part of her family support system, and after Alianna's death, both parents became central figures in seeking justice and preserving her memory. To her relatives, Alianna was not defined by the crime that later brought national attention to her name. She was a daughter, a cousin, and a teenager who had people around her who cared deeply about her. Family members described Alianna as a friendly and affectionate child. She enjoyed being around people she trusted and was known for her positive attitude. Those who knew her remembered her for the way she interacted with others and the personality she brought into everyday moments. Like many teenagers her age, Alianna was still growing and developing her identity. She was attending school, spending time with family, and experiencing the normal routines of adolescence. Alianna was also living with a developmental disability, which made consistency and familiarity especially important in her daily life. Her family understood her needs and worked to ensure she had a stable routine, especially when traveling to and from school. That routine would later become one of the most important parts of the investigation. Alianna attended E-Prep and Village Prep Woodland Hills, a charter school in Cleveland, where she was a 7th-grade student. She had been attending the school for approximately 2 years before her disappearance. Her school days followed a predictable pattern. She would wake up, prepare for class, leave home, use public transportation, and travel along a route she knew well. The trip required her to take an RTA bus and make a transfer before reaching school. For Alianna and her family, this was not a new experience. It was a normal part of her week. There was no indication that January 26, 2017 was supposed to be different. One of the details investigators focused on early in the case was whether Alianna had any reason to leave home voluntarily. In missing child investigations, detectives examine many possibilities. They look at family relationships, recent conflicts, personal behavior, communication with others, and any changes that could explain why a child disappeared. In Alianna's case, the information provided by her family pointed in one direction. She was not known to run away. Relatives said she had not previously disappeared, abandoned her routine, or left home without explanation. They described her as someone who followed familiar patterns and relied on the people around her. That information immediately influenced the direction of the investigation. Instead of treating Alianna's disappearance as a teenager choosing to leave, detectives viewed it as a situation where something had interrupted her normal day. The details of her personality and daily habits became more than background information. They became evidence. The fact that Alianna regularly traveled the same route meant investigators could compare January 26 with what normally happened on other school mornings, where she usually boarded the bus, where she normally transferred, when she should have arrived at school. Every part of her routine created a timeline detectives could follow, and that timeline would become critical because the morning Alianna disappeared did not begin with obvious warning signs. There was no public indication that she planned to leave, no confirmed evidence that she intended to meet someone, no known event that suggested she expected anything unusual to happen. Instead, the evidence showed a teenager beginning an ordinary school day. The tragedy of Alianna's case came from how quickly that ordinary routine changed. A short trip to school became the last confirmed journey of her life. But before investigators could understand what happened, they first needed to answer another question. Was there anything in the days before January 26 that suggested Alianna's disappearance was coming? To find that answer, detectives began looking backward at the final days before she vanished. When a child disappears without explanation, investigators often begin by looking beyond the final known moments. They examine the days before the disappearance, searching for changes that might explain what happened. They look for warning signs, a conflict at home, a sudden change in behavior, a new person in the child's life, any detail that might reveal why a normal day suddenly became abnormal. For Alianna DeFreeze, investigators found no verified signs that something was wrong before January 26, 2017. The days leading up to her disappearance appeared routine. She continued attending E-Prep and Village Prep Woodland Hills. She remained connected to her family and continued following the schedule that had become familiar to everyone around her. There was no public evidence that Alianna had planned to leave home, avoid school, or meet someone that morning. Her family did not report unusual behavior that suggested she was preparing to disappear. Instead, the information available to investigators painted a picture of a teenager whose life was following its normal pattern. That detail became important because it helped detectives rule out one of the earliest possibilities in many missing child investigations, that the child had intentionally left. Investigators examined Alianna's relationships, her recent activities, and her daily interactions. They looked for anything that could explain why she would not arrive at school or return home. But the more they learned about her life, the clearer one conclusion became. Alianna's disappearance was unexpected. Her family knew her habits. They knew how she normally behaved. They knew the difference between a normal delay and something that was completely out of character. On a typical school day, if Alianna was going to be late, plans changed, or she needed help, the people close to her expected there would be some explanation. That was why her absence immediately raised concern. There was also no known evidence that Alianna had previously experienced problems along her route to school. The bus trip was part of her regular routine. She had taken public transportation before and was familiar with the process of traveling to class. Nothing publicly documented suggested that she believed she was in danger or that she was afraid of someone before January 26. This made the investigation more challenging. Detectives were not looking for the reason Alianna chose to leave. They were trying to identify the moment when someone or something interrupted a routine she had followed successfully many times before. The investigation narrowed its focus to a short period of time, the hours between leaving home and failing to arrive at school. That window became the most important part of the case. Every minute mattered. Where was Alianna when she left home? Who saw her after she boarded the bus? Where did her path change? And most importantly, what happened between the last confirmed moment she was seen and the discovery that she was missing? Those questions would guide investigators through the next stage of the case. On January 26th, Alianna left home, expecting to complete another ordinary school commute. But within hours, that ordinary morning would become the beginning of one of Cleveland's most closely followed criminal investigations. The answers would come from surveillance footage, witness accounts, and forensic evidence. But first, detectives had to reconstruct the final journey Alianna was known to have taken, the morning she disappeared. On Thursday, January 26, 2017, Alianna DeFreeze began her morning the same way she had many times before. She woke up, prepared for school, and followed the routine her family knew well. There was nothing publicly known that suggested she expected anything unusual to happen that day. Her destination was familiar. She was supposed to arrive at E-Prep and Village Prep Woodland Hills for another day of classes. Shortly after 6:30 a.m., Alianna left her home with her mother, Alianna DeFreeze. The two walked together toward the Greater Cleveland Regional Transit Authority, commonly known as the RTA bus stop near East 149th Street. For Alianna, it was another moment of a familiar routine. She watched her daughter prepare to continue the trip to school, expecting that Alianna would arrive safely and return home later that afternoon. That would be the last confirmed time Alianna's family saw her alive. After boarding the bus, Alianna's movements were captured through surveillance footage from the RTA system. The video would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the investigation, because it allowed detectives to establish a timeline based on confirmed locations and times. The footage showed Alianna riding the bus normally. There was no indication from the video that she appeared distressed or that anything unusual happened while she was inside the vehicle. She eventually reached the area near East 93rd Street and Kinsman Road, where she was expected to transfer to another bus that would continue toward her school. This transfer point was not unfamiliar. It was part of the route Alianna had taken before. But on this morning, something changed. Alianna never boarded the next bus. Instead, after leaving the first bus, her movements became unclear. That missing portion of the timeline became the central focus of the investigation. Detectives knew the beginning of her journey. They knew when she left home. They knew she boarded the RTA bus. They knew where she exited, but they did not know what happened during the minutes after she stepped away from the bus. As investigators reviewed additional surveillance footage, they noticed another person appearing in the area near Alianna. A man wearing a light-colored hooded sweatshirt was seen nearby shortly after she exited the bus. At that moment, the footage did not immediately identify him as a suspect. Investigators had to determine whether his presence was significant or simply coincidental. The difference would depend on what happened next. Detectives carefully examined the footage, looking at the direction each person traveled, the timing between movements, and whether the individuals appeared connected. The review created a new line of questioning. Who was this man? Why was he in the area? And did he have any connection to Alianna's disappearance? While investigators worked to answer those questions, Alianna's school day had already begun. At E-Prep and Village Prep Woodland Hills, her absence was recorded. But her family was not immediately aware that she had never arrived. That delay would later become one of the most discussed issues connected to the case. For several hours, the situation remained unknown to the people searching for her. Her family believed she was at school. The school knew she was absent, and investigators had not yet been called. It was only later, when Alianna contacted the school to find out why Alianna had not returned home, that the seriousness of the situation became clear. Alianna had never made it to class. The information immediately changed everything. She was no longer simply late. She she was missing. The family contacted authorities, and Cleveland police began the process of locating her. The first priority was determining exactly where Alianna's path had changed. Detectives began collecting every available piece of information: the RTA surveillance footage, the school attendance records, statements from family members, possible witnesses in the area, any camera footage that could extend the timeline. The investigation was now focused on a narrow but critical question: what happened in the minutes between Alianna leaving the bus and disappearing from public view? Those unanswered minutes would eventually lead investigators to the evidence that changed the entire case. But before that evidence could be found, detectives first had to begin the urgent search for a 14-year-old girl who had vanished on her way to school. When Alianna DeFreeze failed to return home after school, her family immediately knew something was wrong. For the people who knew Alianna best, the situation did not match her normal behavior. She was not someone who would disappear without explanation. She was not known to leave home unexpectedly or ignore the people who cared for her. The first concern was simply understanding what had happened. Had she become delayed? Had something happened on the way to school? Or had someone prevented her from reaching her destination? Those questions became more urgent when Alianna DeFreeze contacted E-Prep and Village Prep Woodland Hills and learned that Alianna had never arrived for class. Until that moment, the family had no reason to believe she had not made it to school. They expected she was safe inside the building. Instead, they learned that the last confirmed part of her journey was the bus ride that morning. Alianna had disappeared before reaching the classroom where she was expected to be. The family contacted police, and the Cleveland Division of Police began investigating the case as a missing child investigation. From the beginning, detectives treated the situation seriously. They did not view Alianna's disappearance as a teenager simply choosing to stay away. Information from her family, school records, and her normal behavior suggested that something unexpected had happened. Investigators immediately began gathering the basic facts needed to reconstruct her movements. They spoke with Alianna's family to establish her normal schedule. They confirmed when she left home. They learned the route she normally took to school. They examined whether anything unusual had happened recently that could explain why she was missing. The answers continued pointing toward the same conclusion. Alianna had started her day normally. Something had interrupted it. Detectives also contacted school officials to determine exactly when her absence was recorded and what procedures had been followed after she failed to appear. The question of when the family should have been notified would later become a major issue connected to the case, but at that moment, investigators were focused on one goal: locating Alianna. Officers began searching areas connected to her route. They checked locations near the bus stops. They spoke with residents in the surrounding neighborhoods. They looked through areas where a child might have gone, or where someone might have taken her. Community members also joined the search. As news of Alianna's disappearance spread, volunteers helped distribute information and search nearby areas. Flyers were shared, tips were reported, and people across Cleveland hoped that someone would provide information that could bring her home safely. Every possible lead had to be examined. In missing child cases, even a small detail can change the direction of an investigation. A person who saw something unusual, a camera that captured a few additional seconds of footage, a statement that seemed insignificant at first. Detectives began collecting all available surveillance footage from the areas Alianna traveled through. The RTA footage had already established the beginning of her journey. Now investigators needed to understand what happened afterward. They wanted to know, where did Alianna go after leaving the bus? Did she continue toward school? Did someone approach her? Was anyone following her? The surveillance review became a major part of the investigation. Detectives carefully examined video from different locations, looking for connections between separate moments. At the same time, officers continued searching the neighborhood around East 93rd Street and Kinsman Road. The area included abandoned properties and vacant buildings, locations investigators could not ignore during a missing person investigation. Each possible location required attention. Each potential clue needed to be preserved. As hours turned into days, the urgency increased. Investigators understood that finding Alianna quickly was critical. They continued treating the case as an active search for a missing teenager, hoping she would still be found alive. But the evidence being collected was beginning to point toward a darker possibility. The surveillance footage had revealed a person investigators wanted to identify. A witness had provided information about a suspicious encounter, and the search area was becoming more focused. The investigation was no longer only about finding where Alianna had gone. It was about determining who had crossed paths with her that morning. Then, on January 29th, 3 days after Alianna disappeared, officers searching near her last known location made a discovery that changed the entire case. The search for a missing child became a homicide investigation, and detectives now had to find the person responsible. On January 29, 2017, the investigation into Alianna DeFreeze's disappearance changed forever. For 3 days, detectives, officers, family members, and community volunteers had been searching for answers. They were still hoping to locate Alianna and bring her home safely. Instead, investigators discovered evidence that confirmed their worst fears. A search of an abandoned house on Fuller Avenue, near the area where Alianna was last seen, led officers to the discovery that transformed the case from a missing child investigation into a homicide investigation. The location immediately became a major crime scene. Before investigators could determine exactly what happened, they had to carefully preserve every piece of potential evidence inside the property. Crime scene investigators documented the location through photographs, measurements, and detailed reports. Every item that could provide information about the events leading up to Alianna's death had to be collected, preserved, and analyzed. The goal was not simply to find evidence of a crime. The goal was to reconstruct what happened, who had been inside the property, when had they been there, and most importantly, who was responsible. The abandoned house provided investigators with several important clues. Forensic specialists searched for fingerprints, biological material, fibers, and other trace evidence that could connect a person to the location. At the same time, detectives continued reviewing the timeline they had already created from surveillance footage. The RTA footage remained one of the most important pieces of the investigation. It established Alianna's final confirmed movements. Investigators knew she had boarded the bus near her home. They knew she traveled toward school. They knew she exited near East 93rd Street and Kinsman Road. The next challenge was understanding what happened after she left the bus. The surveillance footage showed a man in the area shortly after Alianna exited. Investigators began working to identify him and determine whether his movements were connected to her disappearance. The footage alone was not enough to prove what happened. It was a lead. The investigation required additional evidence. Detectives began interviewing people who may have been near the area that morning. They spoke with residents, workers, and anyone who might have observed something unusual. One witness provided information that became an important part of the timeline. The witness reported seeing a man with a young girl in the area around the time Alianna disappeared. At the time, the interaction did not appear immediately suspicious because the witness believed they may have known each other. However, after learning that Alianna was missing, the witness contacted investigators and provided details that helped detectives understand the sequence of events. This information supported what investigators were already seeing in the surveillance footage. The video showed a possible connection. The witness account provided additional context. The crime scene provided physical evidence. Together, these pieces began forming a clearer picture, but investigators still needed scientific confirmation. That came through forensic testing. Evidence collected from the Fuller Avenue property was submitted for laboratory analysis. Specialists examined biological samples and compared DNA profiles to determine whether they could identify individuals connected to the crime scene. The process required careful testing and verification. Forensic evidence is not considered in isolation. Investigators must examine how it fits with the rest of the case. In Alianna's investigation, the DNA results became one part of a larger body of evidence that included surveillance footage, witness information, and the reconstructed timeline. The laboratory analysis eventually connected Christopher Whitaker to evidence recovered during the investigation. For detectives, this was a major development, but they still had to evaluate the entire case. A DNA connection was significant, but investigators needed to understand how it matched with everything else they had discovered. They examined Whitaker's background. They reviewed his known movements. They compared his possible involvement against the timeline established by surveillance footage and witness statements. The evidence continued pointing toward the same conclusion. Investigators had identified a suspect. The next step was learning more about him and determining whether his history provided any insight into how he became connected to Alianna's case. Christopher Whitaker was not unknown to law enforcement. His criminal record would become an important part of understanding the investigation, although detectives still had to prove his involvement through evidence connected specifically to Alianna's disappearance. By this stage, the case had moved far beyond a search for answers. Investigators had a victim. They had a crime scene. They had forensic evidence. And they had a suspect. But before prosecutors could present the case in court, detectives needed to understand exactly who Christopher Whitaker was and how investigators connected him to one of Cleveland's most closely watched criminal cases. As investigators continued building the case against Christopher Whitaker, they also examined his background. Understanding a suspect's history does not determine guilt by itself. A previous conviction cannot replace evidence in a new investigation. But for detectives, Whitaker's past provided important context once the evidence connected him to Alianna DeFreeze's case. At the time of Alianna's disappearance, Christopher Whitaker was 44 years old and living in the Cleveland area. Public records showed that he had previous involvement with the criminal justice system, including a serious conviction more than a decade earlier. In 2005, Whitaker was convicted in connection with an attack on an adult woman. He pleaded guilty to sexual battery and felonious assault after prosecutors accused him of violently attacking the victim inside her home. The original charges included attempted murder, but as part of a plea agreement, Whitaker was convicted on the sexual battery and felonious assault charges. He received a prison sentence and was later released. That conviction also resulted in Whitaker being classified as a registered sex offender. For investigators reviewing Alianna's case, this history became relevant only after the evidence began connecting him to the crime. Detectives did not arrest him simply because of his past. They had to establish a connection between Whitaker and the events surrounding Alianna's disappearance. That connection developed through multiple investigative steps. After identifying the man seen near Alianna's final known location, detectives worked to determine who he was and whether his movements matched the timeline they had reconstructed. They reviewed surveillance footage. They examined witness statements. They analyzed forensic evidence recovered from the Fuller Avenue property. Each piece of information was compared carefully. The investigation was built around consistency. Could the person seen near Alianna be identified? Did that person have a connection to the crime scene? Did the physical evidence support the timeline? As detectives continued investigating, Christopher Whitaker became the focus of their attention. The evidence suggested that he had been in the area where Alianna disappeared and that he was connected to the location where investigators later found evidence related to the crime. Forensic testing became one of the most significant developments. DNA evidence recovered during the investigation connected Whitaker to the Fuller Avenue property. However, investigators still had to place that scientific evidence into the larger context of the case. They compared the DNA findings with the surveillance footage and witness information already collected. The result was a case built from several independent sources. The surveillance footage helped establish Whitaker's possible movements. The witness statement supported the timeline. The crime scene evidence connected him to the location. The DNA evidence provided scientific support. Together, investigators believed they had enough information to identify Whitaker as the person responsible. But before making an arrest, detectives continued examining every detail. They reviewed his statements, looked into his recent activities, and prepared the necessary legal documents to move forward. Because of Whitaker's criminal history and the seriousness of the allegations, authorities approached the arrest carefully. The investigation had reached a turning point. For days, Cleveland had been searching for a missing 14-year-old girl. Now detectives believed they knew who they needed to find. The next step was taking Christopher Whitaker into custody and confronting him with the evidence they had collected. On February 3, 2017, that happened. Working with federal authorities, including U.S. Marshals, investigators located Whitaker in Mayfield Heights, Ohio. He was arrested without a major confrontation and taken into custody. For Alianna's family, the arrest represented a major development. They finally knew that investigators had identified a suspect. For detectives, however, the work was not finished. An arrest was only the beginning of the next stage. They still needed answers. They needed to understand what happened after Alianna left the bus. They needed to compare Whitaker's explanation with the evidence already collected. And they needed to build a case that could survive the highest level of legal scrutiny. The next conversation between investigators and Christopher Whitaker would become one of the most important moments in the entire investigation. Because inside the interview room, detectives would hear his first explanation of what happened, and they would compare every word against the evidence they already had. After Christopher Whitaker was taken into custody on February 3, 2017, investigators moved into the next critical phase of the case. They already had gathered significant evidence. They had surveillance footage showing the final known movements of Alianna DeFreeze. They had witness information that helped establish what happened after she left the bus. They had forensic evidence connecting Whitaker to the investigation. Now detectives needed to hear directly from the person they believed was responsible. The interview was not conducted to discover whether investigators had a suspect. They already did. The purpose was to compare Whitaker's explanation with the evidence they had spent days collecting. Inside the interview room, detectives began by asking basic questions about Whitaker's background, his movements, and his connection to the area where Alianna disappeared. Initially, Whitaker denied involvement. He denied knowing Alianna. He denied having any connection to her disappearance. He presented himself as someone who had no explanation for why investigators were questioning him. For detectives, this response was expected. In serious criminal investigations, suspects often begin by denying involvement. Investigators are trained not to rely only on statements made during an interview. Instead, they compare those statements with physical evidence and witness accounts. Rather than immediately challenging Whitaker, detectives allowed him to explain his version of events. They asked questions. They listened. They documented his answers. Then they began introducing evidence that contradicted his claims. One of the most significant moments came when investigators confronted Whitaker with forensic evidence connecting him to the Fuller Avenue property. The evidence created a problem for his original explanation. Earlier, Whitaker had denied any connection to the location. But when detectives presented information showing that evidence linked him to the property, his account began to change. He acknowledged that he had been inside the abandoned house. This was a major shift. The person who had initially claimed no connection to the case was now admitting a connection to a location that had become central to the investigation. Detectives continued questioning him about his relationship with Alianna and what happened after she left the RTA bus. As the interview continued, Whitaker provided a different version of events. He admitted that he encountered Alianna that morning. However, he attempted to explain the circumstances in a way that investigators believed conflicted with the evidence they had already gathered. Whitaker claimed that he had been under the influence of drugs and that his memory of certain events was unclear. He also made statements attempting to reduce his responsibility for what happened. Investigators compared each statement against the facts they had established. The surveillance footage, the witness information, the forensic findings, the location where evidence had been recovered. The problem for detectives was not simply that Whitaker's explanation was different from theirs. It was that his explanation changed as more evidence was revealed. First, he denied knowing Alianna. Then he admitted encountering her. First, he denied being connected to the abandoned house. Then he acknowledged being there. Each change created additional questions. Investigators also examined Whitaker's explanation regarding Alianna's presence with him. According to Whitaker's statements, he attempted to portray the encounter as something different from what prosecutors would later argue occurred. However, detectives found that his explanation did not match the evidence they had collected. The witness account did not support the idea that Alianna had simply chosen to leave with him. The surveillance timeline showed investigators how their paths came together. The forensic evidence connected Whitaker to the location. By the end of the interview, detectives believed Whitaker's own statements had provided additional information that could be used alongside the other evidence already gathered. Following the interrogation, Whitaker was formally charged with multiple offenses connected to Alianna's death, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, rape, aggravated burglary, abuse of a corpse, and obstruction of justice. He appeared in court before Judge Carolyn B. Friedland, where he was ordered held without bond. As the case moved forward, prosecutors began preparing for trial. The evidence collected during the investigation had to be organized into a legal argument that could prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That meant every part of the case would face examination. The surveillance footage, the witness testimony, the forensic analysis, the interrogation. The defense would have the opportunity to challenge the state's version of events. The prosecution would have to prove that the evidence connected Christopher Whitaker to Alianna's murder. The investigation had identified a suspect. Now the courtroom would decide whether the evidence was strong enough to hold him accountable. After months of investigation, the case of Alianna DeFreeze moved from the streets of Cleveland into a courtroom. The question was no longer where Alianna had gone, or who investigators believed was responsible. The focus was now whether prosecutors could prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Christopher Whitaker committed the crimes against her. Because prosecutors were seeking the death penalty, the trial received significant attention. The courtroom proceedings would determine not only Whitaker's future, but also provide Alianna's family with the final legal answers they had been waiting for. The trial took place in Cuyahoga County, under Judge Carolyn B. Friedland. Representing the state was Assistant Prosecutor Catherine Elizabeth Mullen, who led the prosecution's case. Whitaker was represented by defense attorneys Thomas Shaughnessy and Fernando Mack. The prosecution built its case around a timeline. They began by showing jurors who Alianna was, before focusing on the crime itself. They explained her normal routine, her school commute, and why investigators immediately believed her disappearance was unusual. The state then presented surveillance footage from the RTA system. The footage helped establish Alianna's final confirmed movements. Prosecutors explained how she boarded the bus, followed her normal route, and exited near the transfer point where she was expected to continue toward school. The prosecution argued that the footage also showed Whitaker in the same area shortly afterward, becoming the first major link between him and Alianna's disappearance. Jurors also heard testimony from witnesses who helped investigators reconstruct what happened that morning. One important witness described seeing a man with a young girl near the area where Alianna disappeared. At the time, the witness did not understand the significance of what they had seen. However, after Alianna was reported missing, the information became an important part of the investigation. The prosecution then turned to forensic evidence. Investigators explained how the abandoned house on Fuller Avenue was processed after Alianna was found. Crime scene specialists collected and documented evidence carefully, preserving materials that could later be examined in court. DNA experts testified about the laboratory testing that connected Whitaker to the crime scene. Prosecutors emphasized that the case was not based on one piece of evidence alone. Instead, they argued that several independent pieces of evidence all pointed in the same direction. The surveillance footage established the timeline. The witness testimony supported investigators' reconstruction. The forensic evidence connected Whitaker to the location. The prosecution also focused on Whitaker's statements after his arrest. Detectives testified that Whitaker initially denied knowing Alianna or having any involvement. However, after being confronted with evidence, his account changed. Prosecutors argued that these changing explanations showed an attempt to adjust his story as investigators revealed what they knew. The defense did not argue that another person committed the crime. Instead, attorneys Thomas Shaughnessy and Fernando Mack focused on challenging parts of the prosecution's interpretation and presented information about Whitaker's background, including his history of substance abuse. They argued that his personal struggles should be considered when determining punishment. However, prosecutors maintained that his past did not excuse his actions and pointed to his previous violent conviction as evidence of a continuing pattern of dangerous behavior. Alianna's family also had the opportunity to speak about who she was beyond the investigation. Their testimony reminded the courtroom that behind every piece of evidence was a real person, a teenager with a family, a routine, and a future that was taken away. After hearing weeks of testimony and reviewing the evidence, the jury began deliberations. On March 13, 2017, they returned with their decision. Christopher Whitaker was found guilty of aggravated murder, kidnapping, rape, and other related charges. For Alianna's family, the verdict represented accountability. But because the case involved the death penalty, another phase of the legal process remained. The jury now had to decide the appropriate punishment. The sentencing phase required the jury to consider two possibilities: life in prison without the possibility of parole, or the death penalty. Prosecutors argued that the circumstances of Alianna's murder and Whitaker's criminal history justified the maximum punishment allowed under Ohio law. They pointed to his previous conviction for sexual battery and felonious assault and argued that his actions demonstrated a serious danger to the community. The defense asked jurors to consider mitigating factors, including Whitaker's history of addiction and personal difficulties. Whitaker also addressed the court and expressed regret for what happened. However, prosecutors argued that his statements did not erase the evidence presented during the trial, including his changing accounts and the forensic evidence connecting him to the crime. After considering the arguments from both sides, the jury recommended the death penalty. Judge Carolyn B. Friedland accepted that recommendation. Whitaker was sentenced to death for Alianna's murder. He also received additional prison sentences totaling 48 years for other convictions connected to the case. For Alianna's family, the sentence brought legal accountability, but it could not undo the loss they experienced. Her father, Damon DeFreeze, later explained that while many expected the family to support execution, he personally believed life without parole would have been a stronger punishment, because Whitaker would spend every day facing the consequences of his actions. Under Ohio law, death sentences automatically receive review by the state's highest court. Whitaker's attorneys appealed the conviction and sentence, raising several legal arguments. The defense challenged aspects of the proceedings and argued that certain factors should have been considered differently during sentencing. The Ohio Supreme Court reviewed the case and ultimately upheld both the convictions and the death sentence. Whitaker remained on death row. However, Ohio's broader pause on executions affected his sentence. Because the state has faced difficulties obtaining the required drugs for lethal injections, executions have been repeatedly delayed. Although the legal process continued, Alianna's family focused on another goal. They wanted her name to represent change. They wanted future families to have protections that they did not have on the day Alianna disappeared. That mission became the next chapter of her story. Alianna DeFreeze's story did not end with a courtroom verdict. After losing their daughter, the DeFreeze family turned their attention toward preventing other families from experiencing the same situation. One of the major issues raised after Alianna's disappearance involved school attendance notifications. Her family argued that they should have been informed much earlier that Alianna never arrived at school. That concern became the foundation for legislative changes in Ohio. The result was known as Alianna's Alert, a law designed to require schools to notify parents within a specific time frame when a student is absent without explanation. The purpose was simple. Parents should know quickly when a child who is expected at school never arrives. While no one can know whether an earlier notification would have changed the outcome of Alianna's case, the family believed the system needed to improve so another parent would not experience the same delay. The family also pursued a wrongful death lawsuit involving multiple parties connected to the circumstances surrounding Alianna's disappearance and the abandoned property where she was found. The case was eventually settled, with the family receiving compensation. However, their focus remained larger than financial recovery. They continued advocating for safer communities and stronger protections for children. Through the Alianna DeFreeze Let's Make a Change Foundation, her family worked to support families, provide community assistance, and keep attention on issues affecting children and neighborhoods. Alianna's cousin, Ariel DeFreeze, became one of the people helping continue that mission. The family also continued speaking about the dangers created by abandoned properties. The house on Fuller Avenue was later demolished, but Alianna's family wanted people to understand that the problem extended beyond one building. Unsafe abandoned locations existed throughout many communities, and they believed addressing those problems could help prevent future tragedies. Years after her disappearance, Alianna is remembered for more than the crime that took her life. Her name is connected to changes in school safety policies, community awareness, and efforts to protect children. Alianna was 14 years old when she disappeared, while following a routine she had completed many times before. The investigation that followed revealed failures, raised difficult questions, and ultimately led to justice for her family. But the most lasting part of her story is what happened afterward. A family facing unimaginable loss chose to create change. They turned grief into advocacy. They made sure Alianna would not only be remembered as a victim, but as someone whose name helped improve the lives of others. If you appreciate carefully researched true crime documentaries that focus on facts, investigations, and remembering victims with respect, consider subscribing. Your support helps us continue telling these stories with accuracy and responsibility. Alianna DeFreeze's life was far too short, but through the work of her family and community, her name continues to make a difference.